Welcome to The Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Find us wherever you listen to podcasts and subscribe on our website at thetwotestaments.com, where you can find our library of episodes and donate to support our work. Follow us also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Welcome to The Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And I'm Will Kynes.
And in this episode, we're looking at the books of Habakkuk and Zephaniah, and we're joined today by Dr. Heath Thomas.
Heath Thomas is president and professor of Old Testament at Oklahoma Baptist University. Somehow, he does both, and does them both well. I want to talk about your scholarship in a minute, but first, I thought I'd give you an opportunity, Heath, to tell us a little bit about Oklahoma Baptist University and what's going on there.
Sure. So OBU is Christian university that's been here in the state. It really was the brainchild of a motley crew of Baptist groups when Oklahoma was Indian Territory. And so they got together, and one of the most innovative things that they did is they said, we have all of these different groups of Baptists together. What do we need in our day? And they were looking at the eve of statehood. And what they came up with was pretty surprising. They, in their founding charter, what they said is we want a Christian university, coeducational on equal terms. And then they stipulated in the charter what that looked like. And if you can imagine every aspect of a society impacted with folks who have been equipped with a world-class Christian education, that's really what they wanted. And so if you look at our charter, OBU was, as a university, founded to train in what you might typically think of as, your Christian liberal arts, humanities. But their vision was actually much broader than that. Government, politics, law, medicine, technology, both abstract and applied. About the arts, the fine arts, music, anything that you can think of that you would need in a new state for it to thrive and flourish. That was the vision of OBU. And so that was the founding vision. We were incorporated in 1910, and we've been absolutely a phenomenal university ever since. And so right now, some investment areas for us, we're not backing down from that Christian distinctive. We want to see this next generation equipped to live all of life, all for Jesus, regardless of what your background is. And we want to provide world-class education at the highest level. And so we're doing that through engineering and nursing and pre-med and about everything that you can think of. So it's an exciting time for us. Although we were just hit by a tornado on April 19th. We're recovered, and there were no injuries and no fatalities, thank God. But yeah, pretty crazy.
Were buildings damaged?
Yeah, every building was impacted. 1.478 million square feet of space, about 4,000 or 5,000 rooms. I can't remember. Every building, every room was impacted at some level or another. So strange. We just got a major kickstart to our strategic plan.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, these days, presidents spend a lot of their time raising money and overseeing building projects, but probably no president wants to oversee that many different building projects all at the same time.
Yeah, no, I was taking our board chairperson through some of the facilities, and it just kind of struck me. I just took him through about 8 different of our facilities, and everyone has different kinds of renovation, remodel, or restructuring going on. So, and that's only scratching the surface. So kind of an exciting time. But at the end of the next 12 to 24 months, we'll have in large scale a brand new campus. So, hey, it's all good.
Yeah. Well, we are going to talk, as we look at these two biblical books, a little bit about destruction, but also rebuilding. There is a connection there. And speaking of biblical books and your work with biblical books, so I first came across you in terms of your work on Lamentations, which has had some overlap with mine. But you have also done a lot of work in the prophets. Habakkuk, you've got the Two Horizons Old Testament commentary on Habakkuk, and then also a book called Faith Amid the Ruins, the book of Habakkuk, and that's published by Lexham Press. And then, hot off the presses, We have the Old Testament Minor Prophets, a theological introduction, which you have with you. And
Yeah,
this is
but
just an
bizarrely,
author copy.
I got my author copies last night. So very exciting.
Yeah, so maybe that book, you could tell us a little bit about what readers would encounter in that new book.
Yeah, so this book is actually really extraordinary. Right now in the prophets, there is a massive amount of work being done on social exploration of the prophets. Redaction criticism, especially in the minor prophets, is there's a lot has been done in the past 20 years and still a lot going on there. There's, interestingly, a new look on kind of rhetorical criticism, or new form criticism is what some would call it. There's a lot of work now on oral performance in the prophets. So really interesting stuff going on. Ours, what we do is we note and recognize all of those approaches. But one of the things that we focus on is there's just not, as far as the minor prophets go, there's not a lot that's theologically rooted and grounded. And what I mean by that, it's a focus on God. What is God saying in and through these prophets, both individually and then kind of synthetically as you read the prophets as a whole. And so what we've done there is we've kind of introduced that problem of kind of a vacuum of theological voice in the study of the prophets. We also look at kind of the story of how the prophets have been read, both in the ancient church, and by that I mean from really the first century, a little bit in Qumran and Second Temple literature, all the way up through around the Reformation. As kind of, we had to stop somewhere. So that's kind of, we do kind of give a canvas of that story. And then we look at the ancient world of prophecy. Who were prophets? How is the voice of the minor prophets differ? And how is it similar to other ancient Near Eastern, or maybe better, ancient West Asian peoples? And so that's what we do there. And then we dive into each individual book. We take the approach, and we can talk more about this if you'd like. We take the approach that each book stands on its own, and we want to understand its theological witness first. And then corporately, almost like an anthology, we hear these texts together. And so with that in mind, we look at each individual book, do an analysis of each book, look at the theological distinctives in each book. Ronnie, you'll be interested in this. We're looking at how the New Testament receives the freight of the witness of the Old Testament prophetic book. And then finally, we do close exegetical analyses of significant passages in these books. So for instance, in our conversation today, we look at Habakkuk 2, really 2 to 4, and I do a full chapter just looking at that. We look at the hymnic fragments in Amos. We look at some of these other passages, Micah 6, 8. We do an entire chapter-length exploration there. So it's a really interesting thing that we do in the kind of the analysis of the chapters. And then we break that out into more of a biblical theological chapter. What do the prophets, minor prophets, say corporately in terms of biblical theology? How do these texts resonate in the life and ministry of Christ is the next chapter. And then finally, what do these prophets say to us today? So that's bringing it home. So it's a wide-ranging book. There's a lot going on. But that's probably why it took us about 10 years to do it.
Great. That's fantastic. Well, we're let's begin with getting into some orienting questions on the book of Habakkuk, and then we'll come to Zephaniah in a little bit. All right, so let's start with Habakkuk. What sparked your interest first in, well, maybe the minor prophets or the book of the 12 as a whole, and then perhaps Habakkuk in particular?
Well, professionally, my interest in scholarship has always been lament literature, particularly the Book of Lamentations. Now, if you read Lamentations closely, you find, it's not very happy as a book. It's pretty somber, pretty dark. and so there's some interesting things in that book where you have divine wrath, divine judgment, but in some cases it sounds echoey to prophetic judgment, prophetic oracles of judgment, but it kind of goes its own way. So I was familiar with concepts like the day of the Lord. I was familiar with concepts like divine, oracles of divine wrath, concepts like lawsuit metaphor texts that you would find in prophets. I was also really deeply embedded in ancient Near Eastern concepts of city lament genres that you find in the ancient world. And so all of that was really interesting. I was very familiar with Jeremiah because of the way that scholarship and tradition have associated Jeremiah and Lamentations. I think they go their own way, but that's just me. So I was familiar with that. But then professionally, as you guys understand, and as our listeners probably would understand, sometimes when you're doing this work, a moment of happy providence happens. And this is what happened with me. I had one of my colleagues and friends from the UK say, "Hey, you've been working in this space. We've got the opportunity to write a commentary on Habakkuk. Why don't you pick that up? Because Lamentations is sad. Habakkuk's pretty sad. Why don't you do both of that and just be the guy who focuses on all the sad books?" And that kind of got me in the door. And then I had the opportunity to write a chapter on the entirety of the Minor Prophets, which was a lot of fun. And that kind of put me down the rabbit hole in about a 10 to 12 year, well, gosh, now it's been longer than that. It's been about 15 years that I've been working in the prophets. So just an interesting kind of series of events led me to the prophets and led me to Habakkuk. But the more I got into the book of Habakkuk, the more I began to realize, you know what, this stuff is dynamite and incredibly rich and interesting, extraordinarily stimulating from a literary perspective, from an historical perspective, from a comparative religion kind of perspective. But for me, the real excitement was the theological reading of the text and see what these texts have to say theologically.
Yeah. And we want to get to those theological insights. But before we do, let's think historically. And so what's the historical context of Habakkuk, and what do we know about who wrote it, when, and why?
Yeah, so it depends on how you approach that question. For me, it makes sense to read the book of Habakkuk against the backdrop of the waning of the state of Judah. That's what makes sense to me. Kind of the waxing of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the waning of the Judahite Empire, or nation. It wasn't an empire. That's what makes sense to me. As far as the specifics go, I think really does depend on how you answer that or how you approach that question. Redaction criticism has answered that question variously, usually thinking there's multiple layering or multiple eras in which that text was received and then compiled or adapted, all the way down to potentially the Persian era. But for me, there are a lot of reasons, internal cues, where I think Habakkuk probably fits in the context of the end of the empire, or the beginning of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the end of the Judean state.
Heath, what are the major themes of the book of Habakkuk?
Well, it's a beautiful book. One of the major themes is divine judgment, as you might imagine. This is because a real problem is raised in the book about injustice amongst the people of God, and what's God going to do about it? And so divine judgment for Israel's covenantal kind of faithlessness is a major theme that you find in that book. So divine judgment and understanding what that means, and then how God, how his agency works in utilizing a foreign nation. In chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, we discover that God is going to raise up a nation, an enemy nation. And traditionally, this is known to be the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. This is the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So how is it that God uses a nation like the Neo-Babylonian Empire to discipline his own people? This is a real live question for the prophet And he expounds on that question in chapter 1, verses 12 through 17. So this issue of divine judgment, let me just be real clear. There's also a really interesting interchange theologically on prayer. The prophet, in fact, there's one Jewish scholar called Yehezkel Kaufman who says that Habakkuk is like a little Job, and that's the language he uses. And it's because in such a concentrated way, the book in 3 chapters, but really 2, you get a call and response kind of format to the book that you don't see in other prophets. Jeremiah's closest, but you don't have this kind of concentrated call and response in the way that you do in Habakkuk. So prayer is really, really important. You also have, interestingly, the nature of divine initiative and human responsibility. We might frame this in terms of God's faithfulness versus human faith, or the relationship between God's faithfulness and human faith, and how do those interact? Other ways of looking at that would be divine initiative and human responsibility. Either way, we're looking at how is it that I, as a human being, or we as a community, respond to God faithfully in light of what he is doing, either in grace or in judgment. How do we respond in light of that? And so that's one of the characteristics that you find in the book, especially crystallized in chapter 2. Divine judgment also appears in the woe oracles that you find in chapter 2. And then finally, you find the theological theme of praise. Recognizing divine action as fundamentally restorative or redemptive or just, but recognizing that in praise. So that gets to life before God. What does it mean to be a human being fully alive? It means to be one who learns to praise God even in difficult times. So all of those realities, I think, underpin the context or the theological content of the book of Habakkuk.
Could you briefly summarize for us how the book progresses through its 3 chapters?
Yeah, so chapter 1 begins with a superscription. The superscription looks a little bit like some of the other superscriptions that we have in the Minor Prophets. We only have 6 of them, but it shows up in a superscription. That's verse 1. Chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 is really the language of lament. It's the question of why and how long. And really the language is the prophet is looking to God for help. He uses language that you find, for instance, maybe in Job, certainly in Exodus 2, 22 through 24, where God's people are crying out because of injustice. And that's the language that the prophet uses. Why is this going on? And there's 2 problems that the prophet raises up. Number one, the people are active in their sin, and that's a problem. But the other thing that's really interesting is the prophet says that God is inactive, and that's a problem. And so it's both human sin, which is a problem for the prophet, but also divine passivity, at least as the prophet sees it. And so he asks God to intervene. And that's typical to what you see in lament literature. And then in 5 through 11, chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, you have intriguingly a divine response. And the divine response that God gives to the prophet is shocking. He says, "You're not going to believe this even if I told this to you." Well, he's telling him. And he's raising up an enemy nation to discipline the people. And there's some complexity there between chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 and verses 5 through 11. And we can unpack the complexity. The question is really, how do those 2 sections interrelate? In the final form reading of the book, it looks like a question that God then responds. Redaction critics have a different approach, of course. They would treat 1, 5 through 11 to be primary, and then it was added. All the other stuff was added later. So you get complexity there. But essentially, in the final form reading of the book, God responds. He says he's going to raise up the Babylonians or the Chaldeans as an instrument of divine judgment, which leads the prophet to deeper questioning in verses 12 through 17, essentially saying, hey, how are you going to do this? We're going to die. You're not going to die, God, but we're going to die. And then this nation that you've raised up, how does that just? I mean, they're not even going to worship you. They're not going to rejoice and praise you. They're going to worship their pagan deity. So this divine kind of raising up the Babylonians is bad news. How could you do this? To which, chapter 2, verse 1, the prophet seems to be kind of setting his feet, folding his arms, and saying, this is my approach. I am going to stand here and wait to see what God says to me.
Yeah. And,
then you get a very interesting section in chapter 2 through 5, which again seems to be a divine response. And that divine response seems to carry over in chapter 2, verses 6 through 20. So chapter 2 all the way through verse 20 looks to be a kind of divine response where God says, look, I understand you have these questions, but number one, I'm going to give you something, a vision, and it has to do with what I'm going to do about the future. It has to do with the end. And in this vision, you're going to see my faithfulness. And what you need to understand is you need to rest in my faithfulness. And I think this is what we understand in verses 2 through 5. God is going to upend the Babylonian idolatry. And then you have a series of woe oracles in 2, 6 through 20, where God says, woe, 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 woe. And it's really a reversal of the Neo-Babylonian power. And they're going to get their just deserts. Chapter 3 carries on. It's a prayer and a praise, where it looks like the prophet is responding to God once again, saying, almost like I had heard about this, but now I really see what's going on. Not too terribly different than, in some ways, what you might think of when you think of Job 42, verse 4 and 5, maybe. But the point is, the prophet says, I've come, I see what you're doing. He rehearses what looks to be Exodus imagery, although a little bit twisted, a little bit tweaked in the first half of chapter 3, verses 1 through 11, where he's recounting God's march through the desert to deliver his people. And then he comes to this place where he says, I'm okay. And he has this incredible affirmation by the end of the book, even though it looks like creation turns upside down and God does it, I'm still going to rejoice and trust God, my Savior. And that's what the book kind of, some people will say it moves from doubt to faith. I don't like that. It moves from faith to a deeper faith. I think that's probably a more accurate characterization of what's going on in the book.
Yeah, I like that. And you've already talked about some of the similarities with the book of Job. And one of them that I find really fascinating is how you have this argument between the prophet and God, but the solution to that argument is a vision of God, where God reveals himself in a deeper kind of way. And after that vision of God, you have, just like Job, you have this new kind of faith. As I like how you put it, a deeper faith. But like you, I think that Job's argument with God, it's not an expression of doubt. It's actually a deeper faith that, hey, if you're the God that I believe you to be, how could you allow this to happen? Which is exactly what Habakkuk seems to be arguing from, that same kind of foundation of faith that's leading him to question God's apparent behavior before him.
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about that, that's exactly where we sit. We don't have the divine perspective because we're human. And I think that's so you go with what you know. You go from the life of faith that you embody at that moment, and what God does. And throughout the book of Habakkuk, and I would say this is true in Job as well, there's these kind of theological redirections. Hey, this is what you thought, But let me kind of broaden your understanding here and your experience, so that's why I would say, this faith to a deeper faith really characterizes, what we find in the book, so that really in terms of his spirituality, in terms of his experience in the book, the character Habakkuk really goes to a broader understanding of who God is, how he sits in relationship with God, and what God is still doing with his people Israel among the nations. And that he couldn't have gotten there if it weren't for the process of question, response, struggle to a new understanding or a new vision of reality. And that, I think, incredibly, I think that is exactly where we stand today. We don't have divine perspective. Yes, we have scripture, but we don't have God's perspective on everything because we're not God. And that's not something to be lamented. That's another way that we can lean more deeply into our Creator and trust that he's going to, in this relationship that we have with him, he's going to open us up to fuller life. And so I think that's probably a good thing.
Heath, you talked earlier when you were talking about your approach to your forthcoming book, your theological introduction to the 12, the minor prophets. You had mentioned that your approach was that you treat each book individually, having its own voice, but then also that you treated it also as part of a collection, right, as a kind of aggregate or a corpus. Can you tell us a little bit about what does Habakkuk contribute, maybe distinctively? But then also, are there some key important connections that Habakkuk has with the other 12 or elsewhere in the canon that you think are important for us to pick up on?
Yes, so I think one of the distinctive elements of the book of Habakkuk is this affirmation that we find in 2 through 4. When you have in chapter 2 through 4 that God gives this vision, and it's a bizarre little turn of phrase that he uses here, that it's if it seems as though this vision is kind of tarrying, don't worry, it's not. If it seems like it's delaying, don't worry, it's not. It's not going to delay. It's hastening towards the end. And so this vision is really important. And this vision is so important that the text says it needs to be written down on tablets as a kind of memorial. Well, okay, that's distinctive in the minor prophets. I mean, that kind of, it's not in, for instance, Isaiah. We have something similar in Isaiah. But for the 12, that's kind of interesting that you have that focus on vision that's written down, that is about the end. And that Kate's that in this idea of future salvation is really what that's, or the future intervention of God in history, where there's judgment and salvation, is kind of probably more the way that I would characterize that vision. What's going on? The vindication of the righteous, judgment of the wicked. And incidentally, this is exactly how some Jewish groups at Qumran in the Second Temple period read that text. So it's fascinating, So I think that's distinctive. I also think the affirmation, and we can talk about the translation of this and how we understand it, but the idea of Habakkuk 2:4, faith in the faithful God, I think that's a distinctive characteristic and a distinctive contribution of Habakkuk in the minor prophets. Both of those two things, as well as the call and response interaction that we have, the way that Habakkuk does it is distinctive. As far as the way that it sits in the 12, well, I've mentioned a few things. Let me just highlight a couple of them. It uses the typical prophetic language that we find in the 12. It uses language that sounds a bit like the day of the Lord, which we find in the 12. That's probably one of the key theological concepts that we find in the 12 is the day of the Lord. You also have things like regnal formula or superscriptions that you would find in the 12. You have a superscription in Habakkuk. You also have woe oracles in Habakkuk. That's true in prophetic literature, but a little bit different than what you would find in the 12. You also have theophany, and chapter 3 oftentimes is linked with Nahum 1 because of the way that they present divine theophany. And theophany here, what I mean by that, is where God really, he reveals himself in usually vindication for his people or judgment of his people. And what happens in that theophany, the entire created order turns topsy-turvy. Mountains melt and lightning strikes and the moon turns dark. All of the sun turns dark, moon turns to blood, that kind of thing. So theophany appears both in judgment but also in salvation in Nahum 1 and in Habakkuk 3. So those are some similarities. But I really think the vision element that needs to be written down, that's distinctive in the 12, and then the faith in the faithful God, I think that's distinctive for Habakkuk.
Great. Let's step in front of the text for a minute. And as an expert in theological interpretation, I know that you'll feel comfortable in this place. So 2 questions I have for you. And you mentioned in the forthcoming book that you look at how the prophets have been received up to the Reformation. So what are some of the major persistent issues that readers have grappled with in their interpretation of Habakkuk through the ages?
Well, the first one is, how in the world do we translate Habakkuk 2:2-4? So that's number one, because it's not uniform in the way that it's received, even in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So you would think that it is, but Paul, when he cites it, or he doesn't even cite it, when he alludes to it in Romans 1:16-17, it's different than what we find, for instance, in Hebrews 10:36-39. It's just different, with different emphases. So how do we translate this? One of the classical questions, probably more today, is how do we render this text? How do we understand it in terms of whose faith or faithfulness is in view? Is God's faithfulness in view, or is it human faithfulness? So in light of what God's going to do in delivering his people from Babylon, Habakkuk 4, is this language really focusing on the just will live by his faith, that is the faith of the follower of God, or is that really not even talking about our faith or faithfulness or whatever? It's really talking about the faithfulness of God. It's how to understand that third person masculine singular suffix, and that's a hard one. I have my views. I think what's going on there is, in the Hebrew text tradition, you've got an emphasis on neither God's faithfulness nor the human faithfulness, but actually the faithfulness of God's vision. So there's a close kind of connection between God giving this vision, speaking about his faithfulness to his people, and the just one will live by the faithfulness of the vision. And that idea drives us into deeper questions about what in the world does the just will live? Does that mean survive? Does that mean eternal life? What's going on here? Luther had some interesting ideas on this, as did Calvin, if we're going to the Reformation period. But I think that verse in and of itself is a very difficult verse. Yep. You also have some interesting elements that have to be kind of really studied closely in chapter 1, where it talks about God and death. There's an ancient kind of question: have scribes altered this to make it a little bit more palatable? Was there an earlier addition to this text that indicated that God died, or God would die? So there's all those kinds of questions, but I think the biggest one that has generated a lot of conversation has been Habakkuk 2-4.
Yeah. And staying in front of the text, are there any issues that people are wrestling with today that you think Habakkuk is particularly helpful for helping us to reflect on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yes, some people would associate Habakkuk with what we call theodicy, or some sort of justification of divine action in light of human suffering. That's typically what we mean by theodicy. And some people would argue that the book is a theodicy. See, God can be trusted because even though you suffer now, God's going to make it all right in the end. He'll set the world to rights. I think there's some truth to that, but I think really theodicy probably isn't the focus of the book. I think spiritual formation is probably the focus of the book. How do we trust God and move from faith to deeper faith when you don't understand? And so the book is not really designed to justify God's action as much as it is it's designed to draw us into a deeper relationship and faithfulness to this God, even if we don't understand his action. And so I think that's where the book is powerful. And the reason I like the book so much and I've really fallen in love with it is because that's really where most of us sit most of the time. We go through life, disease or suffering hits us. Children go their own way, job loss or whatever. And we ask ourselves the two big questions that the Psalter asks, that Job asks, that Lamentations asks, and that question is on the lips of Habakkuk as well, is Lama, why? And Ad Matai, how long, right? Mm-hmm. So these are the questions, right? Do you know why? Because we don't know why, and we don't know how long. And I think one of the great benefits of a book like Habakkuk is it reminds us once again, in our points of deepest need and our points of deepest question, we don't necessarily have to have all the answers, but somehow, some way, God shows up and he meets us in our travail. Mm-hmm. And that encounter is enough. That's what I think that's really the power of Habakkuk. Mm-hmm. And it's the encouragement. We can trust in the faithfulness of the God of Israel, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. We can trust him because he's been faithful in the past. He'll be faithful in the future, even if we don't understand.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into the text itself, because before we get there, we do have to wrestle with Habakkuk through some of these challenging responses that God gives to his questions and his questions themselves. So starting in chapter 1, we get after that superscription, we get Habakkuk just jumps into it. "Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen, nor cry to you violence, and you will not save?" And then by verse 4, at the end of this lament, he says, "The wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, judgment comes forth perverted." And it sounds to me a little bit like Abraham saying to God in Genesis 18, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" Yeah. So how do we interpret God's response then? Because it's surprising, to say the least, that in light of this concern about injustice, God says, "Oh, don't worry, I'm going to send the Babylonians." Yeah. How do we read this?
Yeah, it is. This is by chapter 1, verse 4. You get this. Why the law? This is why the law. That's an interesting Hebrew expression, isn't it? How the law becomes slack or something like that. It's ineffective. It doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And that the reason is because the wicked surround the righteous. And then he goes on to say, therefore, and again, the Hebrew here is interesting. Crooked justice goes forth. Mm-hmm. And so, anybody who knows anything about justice, if it's crooked, it's not justice at all. Yeah. So that, again, the law, crooked justice, laws ineffective, crooked justice, things are bad. So you would expect God to say, "Don't worry, I'm going to put, the right people in place, and I'm going to reverse your situation, and now, it's all going to be okay." And it's almost like in verses 5 through 11, God says, "Oh, I hear you. Don't worry, it's going to get worse." Yeah. And I think this is the surprising thing. We're expecting something as readers, as is apparently the prophet, but God theologically redirects his vision. And this is just, again, a reminder. If we're talking about prayer, some people would say, well, prayer is really about you. It's not about God. It's about changing our views rather than God's views. Here, the way that Habakkuk's vision is expanded is God actually engages his prayer in a way that's surprising. And God is using an enemy nation to discipline his people. So again, I don't want to get into the details between 1, 2 through 4, and 1, 5 through 11, but there is a big question about what's the relationship between these two passages, these two sections. Is it one issue or two? Same thing with 12 through 17. Is the issue, some people would put verses 12 through 17 prior to historically verses 5 through 11. So what's the relationship between all that? I tend to read this more like how it's been put here as a canonical text. And I think that's very helpful because it does give this dialogical thing. If that's the case, then what you find is God is saying that, yes, his people, that's why the Torah is very important, that here the law is the law of God's people. However we want to define this. Somehow this is the law of God's people. It has the echoes of covenantal, the Torah Moshe, it's the law of Moses, has that kind of echo, and somehow it's not working. And so God's true to form, using an enemy nation for covenant curse. And that's kind of how I read this. God utilizing a foreign nation to do his act of judgment is not uncommon. We see this with the Assyrians in Isaiah 10, for instance. We see it in Jeremiah, for goodness sake. And Jeremiah is a rough contemporary of Habakkuk. So, it is interesting. But again, I think this is the way God works. As a human being, of course Habakkuk is going to respond this way.
Well, it actually, maybe what's surprising when you think about it is not so much that God says, oh yeah, there's injustice among the people, so I'll use a foreign nation to judge them, because that's actually par for the course in the Hebrew Bible. What may be more surprising is that once God announces that judgment, Habakkuk responds and says, so what we see in verse 13, for example, your eyes are too pure to behold evil, and you cannot look on wrongdoing. Why do you look on the treacherous and are silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than they? That's perhaps the more radical move in Habakkuk, that the prophet thinks that he, again, on the basis of what he believes about God, you're too righteous to do this. How could you consider this as your solution to this problem?
Yeah, and isn't it a bold statement, right? He says, while the one who's wicked swallows up the one who's more righteous than himself. I mean, that's pretty bold language. I mean, they're bad, God, and we're bad, but we're better than they are. I mean, that's kind of bold. He's got some chutzpah there, I think, and it's really nice. So, and then in this response, the way that he's interacting with God after he finds out what God's doing. His concern is that this enemy nation will wipe them out utterly. And that's a real problem. That's a real concern for him. But then he does in verses 14 through 17, which is interesting. He's using language from Genesis 1, 26 through 27, really explicitly, this idea that you've made mankind like the fishes of the sea, like creeping things that have no ruler. That language is explicitly creation language. And what he's saying here is, this is what you've created us for, dominion. But guess what? We're not going to have dominion. And more than that, this nation that you're raising up isn't going to exercise dominion. They're not going to even worship you. They're going to give praise and worship to their nets, their drag nets, their technology, their instruments of war. But they're not going to praise you. So he uses this kind of an inverted vision of idolatry. Mm-hmm. Normally, it's the prophet denouncing Israel for idolatry. Here, he's saying, although this is an instrument of your wrath, God, they're not going to praise you. They're idolaters. They're not going to worship you. So don't use them, for crying out loud. And besides that, they're going to wipe us out. So it's kind of a two-pronged argument here in 12 through 17. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, as a side note, this text reminds me a lot of a later Jewish text that was written just after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, which is 4th Ezra, where you have this kind of voice of Ezra, and he's speaking as though Israel has become destroyed by the Babylonians. Right. And you have this back and forth dialogue between Ezra and, the angel Uriel, who's speaking for God, presumably. But one of the arguments that Ezra makes is he says, he says, how could this be just that, we, your people, are destroyed by the Babylonians? After all, surely they are not more righteous than us.
That's right.
Is kind of the gist of his argument. And so if God wanted to actually punish Israel justly, then he should have punished us by his own hand and not used another nation, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, let's move on to chapter 2, and you've already mentioned that this has some really distinctive features, right? Not only this vision that Habakkuk is told to write the vision so that those who run may read it. So maybe you can walk us through what the heck is this vision that Habakkuk is supposed to write down, and what maybe interpretive challenges it poses, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of verse 4. Which is that other part of chapter 2 that you said has received so much attention.
Yeah, so in chapter 2, verse 2, we see very clearly that God is responding. I mean, you have that almost like narrative kind of introduction, and the Lord responded and said, and then you get the command, write a vision and make it plain upon tablets. And then that lema'an, I think, so that, or in order that. This is a really weird phrase here. Yarut kore bo. What is going on there? There's been a lot of ink spilled on that phrase. In order that the one who reads may run in it or with it. It's a strange phrase. Interesting, the closest time that you have that verb to run, roots like this, and bow, you don't have many examples. In fact, as far as I'm aware, there's only one. It's in the book of Proverbs. The name of the Lord is a strong tower, and the righteous will run into it, and they'll be safe. That's the only other cotext that we have that has this kind of construction. And so some people would say, basically what God is asking him to do is make it some sort of placarded revelation, some tablets that he's able to write down this vision, this word of judgment, and he's supposed to run around with these, tablets, letting everybody know, hey, the bad day's coming.
So that would be interpreting it, the righteous run with it.
Yeah. So that's possible. I think this is metaphorical. I think because I don't think this, whatever the vision is, I don't think it's designed to instill terror or fear. I think somehow, some way, in light of what the prophet has complained about in verses 12 through 17, God is looking to provide succor, help, comfort. And so there's something about this vision that provides help rather than terror. And so it becomes this kind of metaphorical shelter. The vision itself is something that the faithful can run into. Is it a booth or a shelter? Literally, no. But I think it's metaphorical that you can run to this thing, this vision, whenever you have challenge or stress or fear or the invading army is on their way. Something about the vision is going to provide comfort. And that's the content of the vision is what we get later in 4 through 20. I think whatever the content of the vision is that's written down, the best candidate for that is really 4 through 20. That is what's actually written down. So the making it plain on the tablets is really the just will live by faith. The right, depending on how you translate 5, wine betrays and the strong man is uplifted. There's no rest, all that kind of stuff. I think that is on there, and I think the woes are on there to emphasize God is just. God is going to provide restoration, vindication for his people, but he's going to judge the Neo-Babylonians. I think that's what's going on there. So I think that's what's going on as far as the tablet goes. There's a lot of question about, verse 4. I could talk about verse 3. But other than that, I'll just say this. It seems like the vision is for an appointed time, and it pants towards the end, lacates. It will not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it will come surely and will not delay or tarry. This vision, it seems like it's far off, but actually it's hastening, it's running, it's quick. So that what it's like is going on here is you get this, again, talking about the human condition. We know something's going to happen, but we can't wait to get there. It's like Christmas morning. We know it's coming, but we can't wait for it to come. So it feels like it's never going to get there, but you know it's only 12 hours away. Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of the anticipation we get for this in verse 3, is we know the vision is coming. It's hastening towards the end, but it's almost like, man, can it get here quick enough? Then by the time you get to 4, you get a contrast between two people. The big question is who are the people? You get somehow, I mean, it could, there's a lot of ways to understand this, but you get a contrast between two parties. You get probably, it either could be the Neo-Babylonian Empire or the king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar. His soul is inflated, right? It's no good. It's bad news.
The text there, verse 4, is look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous live by, and then something going on here.
Something going on there. It's a contrast between those two. Yeah. Yes.
Right.
And then when you get to the heart of 2.4b, that's where things get super interesting. Because
the righteous will live by.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an interesting kind of. It's very brief, It's 3 words. But what do we mean by righteous? What do we mean by his faithfulness? Or, I mean, emunah is the Hebrew word there. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to live? There are 3 main options that I'll just mention briefly. Number 1, you could say that it's the individual person who is faithful to God, even no matter what. It's the person who's trusting in the vision and trusting that, God is on his throne and he's going to take care of his people. That's the righteous one, right? And he's living faithfully, and that's what it means to live by his faithfulness. And live, that's where things get really tricky. What do we mean by live? And one of the real options here is survive. In the context of the 7th century, late 7th century BCE, we know the country of Judah went through serial trauma, 597, 587, 582. You had deportations, mass exiles, etc. I mean, it was bad. And the city of Jerusalem, we know, according to the archaeological record, was razed, and the little areas around Jerusalem were razed. R-A-Z-E-D. And so it was bad. So maybe he's saying that, those people that are trusting in God's vision and are righteous in that way, they will live, survive. That's one option. The other way of saying it is to read this as the righteous by his faithfulness, and that is God's faithfulness, will live. In other words, the emphasis is not on the action or the agency of the faithful person, but rather the agency and the faithfulness of God. And God will preserve the righteous one, whoever that is. A lot of ways to understand that is a communal understanding of tzaddik. The last option that I'll mention here is that it's neither talking about God directly, his faithfulness, or the righteous person's faithfulness or the community's faithfulness. It's talking about the faithfulness of the vision. What God has said is true. The vision is going to provide help and comfort. It's not going to delay. You can trust in God and his vision. And that's a more novel understanding of 2.4b. Still, that doesn't answer what it means to live. Now, I think it does mean survive, but you got to remember 2 through 4 is a unit, right? So we're talking about something that's going to happen at the end, at the appointed time. So there's something about that feels a little bit eschatological. So we're talking about some sort of future-oriented vindication of the righteous, judgment of the wicked at the appointed time. Only God knows that time. So there is an element of survival, but there's also an element of survival beyond death, because at least some of the community we know are going to die. So there's something going on there that's pretty mysterious, but life is extraordinarily evocative. The people of Israel wanted to survive beyond the Babylonian invasion. God here says that they will in some form without being overly specific about how that's going to take place. Then by 2:5 and following, you get these woe oracles, and those woe oracles are basically divine judgment against Babylon. And then you get the beautiful affirmation in 2:20. The Lord is in his holy temple. All the earth be silent before him. And again, the divine verdict has gone out. You can't contravene it. It's done. I think that's what's going on in chapter 2.
Great. So then chapter 3.
Let me just say also, we probably don't have time to get into what you think Paul's doing with all this.
Yeah.
That could be a whole episode on itself. So I encourage readers to go look at your book, which you mentioned that you talk about that there. And also, we did interview Roy Champa on Romans 1, and he talked a little bit about how he understands this phrase, "the righteous will live by faith," to be interpreted and taken up by Paul as well. So
yeah, and he has looked in depth at the intertextual resonances between the various places that Habakkuk 2:4 gets used across the New Testament.
Yeah, well, and I didn't even mention this, but I probably should. In the Greek tradition especially, you have this emphasis that, and I think Richard Hayes has drawn on this as well, the idea that what's in view here is, at least as received in the Greek text tradition, the righteous one is designation of the Messiah.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, the righteous one would live by his faithfulness, or by my faithfulness, if you follow the Greek tradition. Really, it's talking about God raising up the Messianic king, Hatzadik. So, that is attested. I just, from the Hebrew tradition here, I just don't know that it's. I don't know that the New Testament picks it up like that exactly. I would Richard Hayes knows infinitely more than I do, but I think if we're looking at the context of the Hebrew tradition of Habakkuk, it's harder to make that kind of leap.
So we've got chapter 3. It's a psalmic vision that we get introduced as a prayer of the prophet, according to Shigionoth.
Yes.
And it presents God as it uses this kind of warrior imagery, this divine warrior imagery to describe God. So verse 3, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. And describes his power. So verse 6, the eternal mountains were shattered along his ancient pathways. The everlasting hills sank low.
Yeah.
And then when in verse 16, Habakkuk responds, he says, I hear and I tremble within, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters my bones and my steps tremble beneath me. And then we get this waiting language, interestingly, that you brought up from earlier. I wait quietly for the day of calamity to come upon the people who attack us. So this is a terrifying vision that Habakkuk experiences. And then we get this abrupt change. Verses 17 to 19 now have this positive spin on them. And so we get, verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer and makes me tread upon the heights. So how do we pull all of this together? There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, so chapter 3 is fascinating because, again, we have to remember how it opens. Verse 2 is fascinating. I heard, O Lord, your renown or report or something like that. Depends on how you translate that. But he had heard something, but you have hearing, seeing kind of, not contrast, but you have that build in this poetic line. He'd heard about God somehow, but now he sees God. And particularly that language, pa'alacha. I mean, that's pretty interesting language right there. This is the divine wonders. These are the marvelous wonders that we find, for instance, in Exodus. This is the same language. So what's he talking about here? Somehow he had heard, that's an auditory metaphor. He'd heard about God, heard God, but somehow, some way in that process of chapters 1 and 2, he sees God's miraculous wonders. And that is transformative for him. Then you have this theophany image. And if you look at some of the geographical kind of movement in the first half of this, up through 11 or so, what you find is God is on the move in the wilderness. And when God is marching through the wilderness, creation is in tumult. And this happens with theophany. This is not uncommon in the Old Testament. But there's creation language. So the Creator and Covenant Lord is going to march to deliver his people, apparently from the Babylonians. But the way the language is framed and the nations that are mentioned and how the march proceeds, usually and oftentimes commentators will say, well, he's using Exodus language, and they usually mean the Exodus language out of Egypt into the Promised Land. But if you actually read closely this passage, what you'll find is God is not marching out of Egypt through the geography of the wilderness. God is marching from the wilderness to Egypt, if you follow the geography here in chapter 3. Now, the reason that's significant is, and this is the argument that I've made, for instance, in my commentary, the language of God's people, they cried out to God, and they were, sad and oppressed, and God looked upon their state. He noticed their affliction, and he went to deliver. Well, that's the language that we find in Habakkuk 2 through 4. They've positioned themselves in the place of the Israelites, suffering under Egyptian bondage. That's what the prophet does. He uses that language. So here that is God's people. When God's people cry out to him for help, what is God going to do? By chapter 3, we find out what God's going to do. God rises up in the wilderness and marches to deliver his people. It's like, you have all these, in the Old Testament, you have these great recitals of the Exodus experience. And they're recited over and over again. You have these historical recital kinds of psalms. You have prophetic reception of the Exodus motif, for instance, in Isaiah. What's interesting here is Habakkuk, the language here is a little bit different. It's not the mighty victory of God with people in tow, bringing them out from Egyptian bondage. In Habakkuk 3:1 and following, what we have is God is in the wilderness. He has heard his people, and now he's marching down to deliver his people. And so it's an interesting image that's different in the way that tradition is received in the prophecy of Habakkuk. In Habakkuk 3, God has heard, and now God's going to deliver. And it's almost like that's a nice response to chapter 2. If it tarries or it seems to tarry, wait for it. It's going to come. It's not going to delay. The vision is coming true, and this is what God's going to do. And so I think that's what's going on there. And of course, when God shows up, all of creation, it melts because the Creator is touching down on his creation. So that's interesting. And yeah, I mean, this latter half of the book, 16 and following, there you see a little bit of the inner transformation of the prophet. You see that he is now at a place where he knows there's distress, there's a nation coming to invade, and yet now he's coming to the place where he is content. And more than that, even in the face of disaster, where he may or may not survive, he's ready to say, God is my salvation. And that language is extraordinary. He, in the horizon of the text, we have no idea whether actually God has showed up historically or not. But something about the theophany, the kind of the journey that he's gone through with God and this relationship with God, he's able to use this language of, again, at the end here, I will rejoice. I will rejoice. How? Because God showed up, and that was enough. Not circumstances, but God. God showed up. And then his feet tread on high places. That's the language of, the ibex in the mountains. He's able to walk in places no other person can. And he's in the heights now. And so this is a beautiful kind of conclusion. And then, of course, you have the subscription that concludes the book. But so, it's a nice kind of close, although even chapter 3 is a little bit surprising.
Well, thank you so much, Heath, for walking us through Habakkuk. We are going to skip the blurb for now because we're going to get you on the next episode. Next episode with Heath Thomas.
On Zephaniah.
This episode is co-sponsored by Samford University and the Alabama Humanities Alliance, a state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this episode do not necessarily represent those of the Alabama Humanities Alliance, the National Endowment for the Humanities, or Samford University. Thanks also to the Faculty Success Center and our student assistants for their help with production and promotion.